Martin faces a tough choice. Give his cheating ex another chance or leave her and continue his relationship with a new woman who truly loves him. But when he receives shocking photos proving the betrayal, his heart breaks. Can true love conquer all, or is it just manipulation? Betrayal, revenge, and unexpected revelations. This story will leave you on the edge of your seat. What will Martin choose? Martin and Sarah had been married for 5 years. Their relationship had gone through different stages, from their first romantic dates to the routine days when nothing seemed extraordinary. They were happy, although sometimes there were shadows of distrust due to minor arguments and misunderstandings. It all started when Sarah began working on a new project, and a new colleague, Jack, appeared. Martin noticed she spent more time with him than with others, and it began to worry him. He tried not to pay attention, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One day, Martin accidentally found a message from Jack on Sarah's phone. They were discussing work matters, but certain phrases seemed strange to him. It wasn't anything serious, but doubts started to creep in. His inner conflict began. Should he ask Sarah directly, or should he stay out of her personal life? However, the anxiety kept growing stronger. Martin decided to talk to her. One evening, after a pleasant family dinner, when they were sitting at the kitchen table, he decided to bring up the topic. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" he started, nervously twirling a spoon in his hands. "Of course, what is it?" she asked, looking at him with a slight smile. "I've noticed that you're spending a lot of time with Jack. Is it just work, or is it something more?" Sarah paused for a moment. Her expression became a little tense, but she quickly composed herself. "Martin, it's just work-related. You know that I'm always devoted to our family. I would never cross any boundaries. Why are you so worried?" Martin smiled, trying to hide his doubts. "Maybe it's just my imagination. I just feel like something's changed lately." Sarah placed her hand on his. "I understand your concerns, but trust me, everything is fine. You're the most important thing to me." Martin felt his anxiety ease a little, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden from him. To ease his doubts, he decided to pay more attention to Sarah's behavior, but at the same time, he didn't want to question her honesty. However, one evening, when he came home, he noticed that Sarah wasn't there. It wasn't her usual time to return from work. He called her, but she didn't answer. His inner voice told him not to worry, but doubts began to fill him again. A few hours later, Sarah arrived, explaining that she had stayed late at work. Martin couldn't help but notice that her behavior seemed a little strange. Her eyes were slightly red, and her clothes were wrinkled. "What happened?" he asked, trying not to reveal his concern. "Nothing, just a long day." "Sorry, I didn't let you know I'd be late," she said, squeezing his hand. But his suspicions didn't leave him. Martin decided to find out more and observe her. He found Sarah's old computer sitting on her desk. It was risky, but his curiosity got the best of him. When he opened the computer, his eyes stopped at an email with several messages from Jack. They were discussing not only work, but also personal matters. After a brief exchange, Sarah asked Jack to share something important with her. Martin felt his heart drop. It was more than he had imagined. He couldn't understand what was going on, but he was ready to get an answer. The next day, he decided to take action. "Sarah, I know something's wrong. What's going on with you and Jack?" he asked, standing in front of her in their bedroom. Sarah looked at him, her face remaining calm, but the inner pain was hard to hide. "Martin, I want you to understand. A few weeks ago, I started feeling like we were drifting apart. Jack, he was the one who understood me. We talked about a lot of personal things, but it's not what you think." Martin stood there, stunned. He felt like his next step was about to collapse. "You were with him more than necessary," he said, but his voice remained calm, though a storm was raging inside. "I can't explain it, but I didn't cheat on you, Martin. I was looking for support, and he was there. You were too busy." Martin didn't know what to say. His heart was shattered, but he understood it was more complicated than just infidelity. Maybe he was also to blame for not paying enough attention, but how could they rebuild trust? "I don't know if I can forgive this," he said quietly. Sarah stepped toward him. "Martin, I'm sorry. I want to fix everything, but it will be hard." Martin looked at her. not knowing what to do next. Should he continue the relationship or give it a chance for recovery? Martin didn't know what to do next. Sarah's words lingered in his mind, but they didn't bring any clarity. All these years, he had believed their relationship was unbreakable, and even when small arguments occurred, he was confident everything could be resolved. But now everything had become much more complicated. Sarah, I want you to understand, I'm not asking this for no reason. We've been together for quite a few years now, and I can't just pack up and say, it's fine. You've let me down. I feel deceived, Martin said, his voice firm, but hidden pain was evident. Sarah lowered her head, her gaze turning sad. She was trying to figure out how to respond, but her words got stuck in her throat. I know it's hard, Martin, and I can't justify myself, but I want you to know, I didn't mean anything bad when I talked to Jack. He was just someone I could talk to about what was bothering me when you were too busy with work. Martin fell silent. It was hard for him to understand whether these were just casual conversations or if it was something much more serious. Why exactly did Jack become the person she turned to for support so easily? He remembered all those moments when they planned their future together, when they built their dreams. And now, all of that seemed so fragile. Sarah, don't you understand what this means to me? When you spend so much time with him, I begin to doubt if there's anything in our family worth saving. He turned to her, trying to gather his thoughts. How can I trust again if I don't understand what happened between you two? I understand your doubts, Sarah said, her voice calm, but it was clear this issue was troubling her too. Maybe I wasn't honest enough with you. Maybe I started drifting away from you even before Jack appeared. But I never intended to betray you. It's just, everything changed. Martin felt something inside him crack. He was broken, but at the same time, he felt that perhaps this was a chance to see the reality. Maybe he had become too closed off, too absorbed in his work, and now he was paying for it. Sarah, I don't know what to do next, he whispered. It's not easy when your wife spends time with another man. I've started feeling like I'm losing you, and I don't know if I can regain trust. Sarah raised her head and looked him in the eyes. She was moved by his words, but she understood that this wasn't the end. She wanted him to hear her, but she knew this could only be the beginning of their recovery. Martin, I love you. I never wanted to lose you. You're a part of me, and I understand what you're feeling. But I know we need to go through this together to understand if we can still be together. These words held great significance, and Martin felt that this could be a turning point in their relationship. He didn't know if he was ready to give her another chance, but this question was more important than any promises. We can't just turn everything back, Sarah. You need to do more for me to trust again. This will be hard for both of us, but if you really want us to stay together, we need to work on it. Otherwise, I don't know if there's any point in staying. She closed her eyes and nodded. She knew this was her chance to prove that her feelings for him hadn't disappeared, and that she was ready to fight for their relationship. I'm ready, she said. Martin looked at her, and for a few seconds, they just stood in silence, each processing what had just happened. Relationships can't be simple, but they still had a chance to find a way to be together. Meanwhile, Jack turned out not to be just support, as Sarah had tried to present it. When Martin learned more, he found out that Jack was part of a bigger plan, one that eventually revealed itself. Jack wasn't just a friend, but a competitor who had been trying to destroy their marriage from the inside. He wanted Sarah for himself, and it became clear after Martin learned about the subtle hints Jack had been dropping during their meetings. You weren't just with him for work, Martin said the next day, turning to Sarah again. I found out Jack wanted more than just working with you. Sarah immediately fell silent. Her face turned pale, and her eyes filled with sadness. I betrayed you, and not just once. I'm sorry. I did it at work because I wanted to relax, she confessed. I knew this wouldn't go unnoticed, but I didn't think you'd find out. Now I understand why it happened. You were just using me, Martin said. We were both too caught up in our own problems, and he took advantage of that. But I'm willing to fight if you truly want this. I want to, Martin. I want to try again, she replied, trying to fight back her tears. Martin looked at her and decided to give her a chance. He knew it would be hard, but he felt their story wasn't over yet. They could either go through this together or leave the past behind and move forward. They decided to work on their relationship But it was only the beginning of a new battle, a fight for their future together. After Martin found out about Sarah's infidelity, his life didn't become easier. He tried to pull everything together to regain balance. But the realization that his relationship with Sarah had been built on lies wouldn't let him find peace. He lost his confidence in everything he once considered stable. While Martin was trying to find answers, Sarah was dealing with her own emotional storms. She couldn't understand why her decisions had led to such devastation. Her mind was filled with thoughts, but one thing was clear. She couldn't go back to the way things were, even if she desperately wanted to. Martin had become a stranger to her, even though he was her husband. One evening, as Martin sat at home, rereading yet another conversation between him and Sarah, he felt he couldn't keep hitting the same wall. It wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. It was about moving forward, about his own rebirth. Just as he was contemplating the next step, there was a knock at the door. "Martin, can I come in?" It was Sarah. There was something uncertain in her voice, but at the same time, there was hope. She peeked into the room, and Martin saw her eyes, just like they were when they first started dating. But now, it wasn't love he saw, but despair and uncertainty. "What do you want?" Martin asked, unable to believe she was standing before him after everything that had happened. "I know things weren't the way they should have been," Sarah said, sitting down on the chair across from him. "But I want to explain, at least part of it." Martin didn't answer, only waited. It was hard for him to listen, but he knew that without these words, he would never be able to close this chapter. "I understand that what I did was foolish, and I'm not trying to justify my actions. I just don't know why this happened. We've hit walls so many times, and maybe I was looking for an escape." "Looking for an escape, or just an excuse?" Martin replied. She fell silent for a few seconds, trying to find the right words. Martin noticed how her hands were trembling. "I was unhappy," she finally said. "Maybe I was afraid that it was all going to end, so I searched elsewhere for what had long been lost. I can't make you forgive me, and I'm not asking for that. But I at least want to explain part of it." Martin stood there, looking at her, feeling the pain resurfacing again. He didn't know what to say. All those years they had spent together, making plans and dreaming, now seemed like someone else's story. "How do you see this moving forward?" he asked coldly. Sarah sighed deeply. "I don't know. Maybe we both need to find a new path. I understand that you might be ready to let me go, but I still don't know if I'm ready to let you go. This might be the beginning of recovery, or it might lead to nothing." Martin was surprised by her words. She wasn't offering to return to their old life. She was simply asking if there was a chance for a fresh start. "I don't know if I want to take you back," he said after a long pause, "but I'm ready to find the answers for myself. Maybe we need some time." "I understand," Sarah replied, walking up to him. "Martin, I sincerely ask you to find your own way. I know I've hurt you, but I want both of us to be happy. Sometimes that means taking a pause." Martin looked at her, not knowing what to do. Everything he felt seemed like emptiness. He didn't know if he was ready for a new relationship or even for new possibilities. But, no matter what, he knew this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning for him, albeit a difficult one. They stood there in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, but now Martin realized one thing. He was ready to move forward, even though he didn't know if that path would be with Sarah. The next day, he went for a walk, trying to find his purpose. He didn't know what would come next, but now he had more clarity. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting. It was a path he had to walk alone. Martin sat in his office, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his cup, but he couldn't find the answer to the question that had been troubling him for days. How had this happened? How had his life, which once seemed so stable, turned into chaos? Weeks had passed since Sarah found out the truth. She no longer served as the support she once had. Instead of working together to figure out what to do next, they drifted further apart. Sarah felt his indifference growing, and her heart closed off more and more. "I just can't do this anymore," she said one evening, sitting on the couch and looking at Martin, who was standing by the window, lost once again in his thoughts. Martin turned to her, his gaze cold, though in the depth of his eyes, you could see the traces of pain. "What do you mean?" His voice sounded emotionless. Sarah sighed heavily. She knew this wasn't the moment for emotional conversations, but she could no longer remain silent. We're not together anymore. You're not the person you were before. We're like two strangers, and I don't know what to do with that. Martin didn't respond right away. His thoughts were scattered, like a pessimistic chain he was trying to break, but couldn't. You're right, he said, looking at her, and a shadow crossed his face, as if he truly felt it, although deep down, he was also afraid of what had come along with that truth. Martin, I loved you, Sarah said softly, her voice trembling a little. But it doesn't matter anymore when we both despise what we've created together. She stood up and walked toward the door, her steps heavy, each one seeming to take her further from everything that had once mattered. Martin stayed where he was, trying to catch up with her words. But it was too late. Sarah was gone, and he was left alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Sarah sent him a message. We can't be together anymore. We both need time to calm down and figure out what's next. Martin read it and left the phone on the table, trying not to react to the bitterness that still overflowed in his heart. She was right. They had both changed, and what had once been their foundation now turned into a feeling of emptiness. But was this truly the end? Was there still a chance for their relationship to heal? Martin sat in the silence of his home, trying to find answers to the many questions that no longer allowed him peace. Sarah had left him, and although he understood that it was a logical step on her part, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper lay at the core of this escape. Was that the real reason? Or were there other factors he hadn't noticed before? In the next few days, Martin tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept returning to Sarah. He couldn't forget that last conversation when she said she no longer felt a connection between them. Was that moment the real end, or just another phase in their relationship? That evening, he decided to go for a walk to clear his mind. It was a gloomy evening, and the light rain made the atmosphere even more melancholic. Martin's footsteps echoed in the empty park, and he barely noticed someone approaching him from behind. Martin? Martin turned around and saw a young woman he didn't immediately recognize. She was of average height, with dark hair and a dark coat that gave her an air of mystery. Her face was serious, and her eyes seemed familiar. Who are you? He asked, confused. My name is Alice, she replied, taking a small step forward. I'm Sarah's friend. We met a few times when you were together. Martin felt his heart tighten with surprise. Sarah's friend? He repeated, trying to remember if he had met her before. But he couldn't recall anything. Alice gave a slight smile. I know this might seem strange, but I want to talk to you about Sarah. She's not exactly as you think. Martin was surprised and cautious, but couldn't stop himself from listening. His heart was already aching from the breakup with Sarah, and he didn't want her last words to remain so senseless. I'm listening, he said, gathering all his willpower. Alice paused, as if hesitating, then spoke. Sarah wasn't completely happy in your relationship, Martin. I mean, she was never fully happy with what you had. And it wasn't just because of you. She had her own problems that she couldn't solve, even when she tried. But I noticed over time that she was pulling away, and what happened now? It's part of her bigger struggle. Martin felt Alice's words penetrate his mind, leaving more questions than answers. Are you saying that everything is not what it seems? He asked, staring at her in surprise. Alice sighed and nodded. She was in despair, Martin. You have no idea how long she tried to hold this relationship together. And now, when she left, it's not because you were a bad husband, but because she couldn't fight those emotions anymore. Martin thought deeply. He was tired of the endless conversations and felt the situation growing even more complicated. Now, he had even more questions, and the answers seemed to be hiding in a fog. What should I do now? He asked, trying to find some clarity in his mind. Alice stepped closer, her voice softening with compassion. Don't stop, Martin. You can still make your life better, find a new path, even if it's hard. Martin stood silently, looking at Alice, but then suddenly remembered what had happened a few days ago when he entered their shared home and saw the broken cup on the floor. That's when he realized it wasn't just about Sarah, but about himself as well. Maybe he wasn't ready for all of this, and now he'd have to deal with the consequences of his own choices. But with each word Alice spoke, his inner conflict became more tangled. The distance between him and Sarah felt endless, and the possibility of restoring their relationship seemed less and less likely. A new hope began to awaken in his heart, but he still wasn't ready to take the next step. Not yet. I'll think about it, Martin said, raising his head to look at Alice. She smiled. That's all I'm asking for. From that moment on, Martin began to move in a direction that was still unclear to him. Was this a new beginning, or yet another road to a broken heart? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. He couldn't leave his life unchanged. Martin returned home that evening with a heavy feeling in his heart. His mind was overwhelmed with the new thoughts he had gained from Alice. Sarah wasn't who he thought she was. But that made him question everything he had believed about their relationship. If she was the person Alice described, why hadn't he noticed it earlier? The next day, before Martin had a chance to fully sort himself out, Sarah appeared back in his life. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, but she showed up unexpectedly. She came to his door. "Martin, I want to talk," she said quietly, standing in the doorway. Martin looked at her, hesitating. He had only seen her before through message screens and from a distance, but now it was entirely different. She was standing right in front of him, and her expression was soft, though her eyes still carried that same mysterious distance. "Come in," he said after a short pause. His voice was slightly rough, but he was still ready to listen. They sat down on the couch. Silence filled the room. Sarah took a deep breath. "Martin, I know everything happened quickly and not how we both wanted, but it's been really hard for me. I just couldn't take it anymore. I don't feel the same as I used to, and I know it's hard for you to understand that." Martin listened, but his heart was racing. Sarah was just like he remembered her, intelligent, strong, and yet strangely vulnerable. But now, this vulnerability felt like manipulation. "I understand, Sarah," he said, "but why didn't you tell me earlier? Why didn't we talk about it when we still could fix things?" She lowered her head and looked at him with sorrow in her eyes. "Martin, I didn't know what to do. I tried, but I felt like you didn't see me. I was alone, even when I was with you. And that hurts, it really hurts." Sarah paused, and Martin seemed desperately to try to find the right words. He lacked the words to express his pain. How could he have allowed their relationship to end like this? And was it all just a misunderstanding? But what Sarah said next made him pause for a moment. "Martin, I still love you. But I understand it's hard for you to forgive me for what happened. But if you truly want to start over, I'm ready to take a step towards you. I need time and support, but I want us to try again." Martin fell silent, losing the ability to express his emotions. He knew she was manipulating him. Her words were too perfect, too measured to be genuine. Her intention was clear. She wanted to come back, not because she truly regretted it, but because she needed to regain control. He stood on the edge, his heart and mind torn between wanting to give her another chance and needing to protect himself from further manipulation. "Sarah, I don't know what to do. I want to believe this can be fixed, but at the same time, I feel betrayed. How can I trust you again?" His voice trembled but firm. She nodded, understanding his feelings. "I'm not expecting you to forgive me right away, but I'm ready to prove to you that I can be different. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make it real." Martin looked at her, trying to figure out if there was any truth in her words. He saw how hard she was trying, but he also felt that this was just another form of manipulation. She had always been a master at playing with emotions, making people feel guilty and compassionate. However, something in her words still pulled him in. He couldn't forget the past, but there was still doubt in his heart whether he was ready to move forward. "Martin, I know this is hard, but I love you, and I just need a little time to prove that we can fix this. I'll change if you give me a chance." His thoughts were scattered, and he realized that he wasn't ready to let her go completely. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was something deeper, the desire to hold on to what they once had. "Let's start by trying to be honest with each other," he said after a long pause. Sarah smiled. "I'm ready." But what she didn't say remained unspoken. Had she truly changed? And would Martin be able to forgive all her manipulations and betrayals? What was really happening between them was yet to unfold, and Martin wasn't ready for what lay ahead. Sarah sat at a cafe table, watching her fingers play with the coffee cup. She wasn't sure how her life had changed after Martin found out about her secrets. She was glad to have gained some control over the situation, but she felt that something was going wrong. "Martin," she said, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice, "you can't just let all of this go." "Why?" Martin looked at her. His eyes were cold, but not angry. He was ready for something new. "We've already said everything. You did what you did, and that doesn't change how I feel." Sarah couldn't understand if this was a step towards forgiveness or the beginning of an even bigger battle. She knew that Martin still loved her, but part of her doubted whether he could really forgive her. "But you don't even want to talk about it," she said, trying to avoid a direct conversation about her manipulations. She understood that if he found out the truth, everything would be lost. "It's important." "What exactly?" Martin asked, raising an eyebrow. "Do you want me to understand your feelings?" "I already get it. You found other ways to find satisfaction, but now you want to pull me back. You want me to forgive you, and it won't be that easy." Sarah fell silent. She didn't know how to respond, as all her manipulations were so complex that even she was starting to get lost in her own motives. Meanwhile, a new character entered the cafe, Jonathan. He was Martin's friend, but also well acquainted with Sarah. His arrival immediately changed the atmosphere at the table. "Martin, Sarah," Jonathan greeted them, ignoring the tension in the air. "Sorry to interrupt, but there are some things we need to discuss." Martin looked at him in surprise but agreed. "I already have a pretty good idea of what you're going to say," Martin replied. "But if this concerns Sarah, I think it's better to wait until we sort things out between us." "No, it's not what you think," Jonathan responded, leaning in. "This concerns what Sarah has been doing behind your back. I have new evidence." Sarah felt her heart race. She knew the situation was getting more complicated. It turned out that Jonathan had found something that could completely destroy her plans. "What evidence?" Martin stood up, his eyes changing as he looked at Jonathan. "I can't say right now." Jonathan carefully placed a few documents on the table. "But if you want, we can discuss it in more detail." Sarah felt panic creeping in. She began to realize that her manipulations weren't going unnoticed, and that now she'd have to face the consequences of her actions. "What does this mean for me?" Sarah asked, trying to stay calm, though inside she was bracing herself for the worst. "It means you'll have to confess everything," Jonathan said, looking at her directly in the eyes. "Otherwise, you know how this will end." Martin didn't say a word, but his gaze was clear and determined. He seemed to understand that this situation might have worse consequences than he had initially thought. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing her time had run out. She stood on the brink of a decision. Was she really ready to be honest with Martin, or was she willing to manipulate him once again to keep everything on her terms? Meanwhile, Jonathan, one of the few people she trusted, continued to maintain a neutral expression. He didn't look judgmental, nor was he trying to help. His position was very clear. All the answers needed to be found in this situation. "Martin," Sarah said, lifting her head, "I'm ready to answer your questions, but I want us to figure this out together. It shouldn't be just your decision." Martin fell silent and looked at her. His silence meant he wasn't ready to make a decision. All these manipulations, betrayals, and new revelations had become just part of a complicated game, where each of them had a choice. Leave everything in the past or continue fighting for what they once thought was theirs. Kevin sat at his desk in his office, looking over the papers that had piled up over the last week. But his mind was far from work. All he could think about was Sarah and her behavior lately. Her words, her manipulations, it all kept him restless. He felt like she was hiding something, but he couldn't figure out what exactly. As he reread one of the letters, the office door opened, and Sarah walked in. She looked normal, even a little nervous, as she always did when she came to him after difficult negotiations with clients. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. Kevin looked up, not rushing to respond. "About what?" he asked, trying to appear calm. "About us." She took a step closer to the desk. "I know you feel like something is wrong, and I want you to understand, I don't want to lie to you." Kevin clenched his fists, but remained silent, waiting for her to explain. His intuition told him this wasn't going to be just a simple conversation. I did something I shouldn't have done," Sarah hesitated, looking him straight in the eye. I made a mistake, and it's not what you think, but it was my fault. Kevin couldn't understand what exactly she was trying to tell him. Had she cheated? Manipulated him? What did it all mean? He stayed silent, only staring at her, his eyes full of questions. I just don't know how to explain it, she continued. We haven't found time for ourselves in a long time, and I started to feel forgotten. I sought support elsewhere. I know it's wrong, and I don't want that anymore. Kevin felt his heart tighten with pain, but he held it together. He knew he needed to listen, otherwise, he wouldn't understand the whole picture. So, you cheated? That was the only thing he could say, his voice cracking. No, she replied, her voice calm. Yet there was a sense of uncertainty in it. It was more than just a physical betrayal. I lost myself, and that's not what I want you to feel. You want me to forgive you? Kevin asked, his voice cold, but inside, a storm was raging. Sarah was silent. She sat on the edge of the desk, her gaze turning sad. I don't know if I can ask that. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to understand. I still love you. And I want to fix everything, if you give me a chance. Kevin thought for a moment. This was more than just betrayal. It was a conversation about inner fears, feelings of loneliness, and dissatisfaction in the relationship. He could sense her sincerity, but the question remained. Was this enough to rebuild trust? I can't promise you that everything will be as it was, he finally said. But we need to start from scratch. And I need time. Time to understand if we can move forward. Sarah smiled, though her smile was bittersweet. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to prove that. A few days later, Kevin began to notice changes. Sarah was more present. She took small steps to show her commitment. She asked for his help, spent more time with him, and even started taking part in things he usually did alone. But Kevin still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he didn't understand. Something he had to figure out before making any final decision about their future. One evening, when he returned home, he noticed Sarah looking at her phone, her face grim. What happened? He asked, trying to understand what was going on. Sarah hesitated, then took a deep breath. It's a message from one of my old friends. He wants to meet and talk about some things. I think I should go. Kevin didn't know what to say. He felt that something was off, but he couldn't explain what exactly. You want to go? He asked, trying not to show his disappointment. Sarah looked at him and nodded. It's not what you think. I just want to put an end to one chapter of my life. Kevin stood there, his mind filled with questions. Sarah was open. She was honest. But was that enough for them to rebuild their life together? Was it possible she was still hiding something? Sarah sat in her apartment, holding the phone in her hands. She looked at Martin's number, hesitating whether to call. It had been several months since they had finally broken up. She lived alone now, and her life felt empty and lonely. Sarah no longer felt the lightness she had been seeking when she was with Jack. Now, it seemed she had lost the most important thing, Martin's love. Unable to hold back, she dialed the number. Hello? Came the familiar voice. Sarah held her breath. It seemed like this voice sounded different, calmer, more confident. Martin, it's me. Sarah, she said quietly, trying not to reveal her nervousness. Hi, he replied after a brief pause. There was no anger or joy in his voice, just calm politeness. What do you want? I know things went wrong between us, but I'd like to talk. Maybe we could meet? She didn't know what else to say. She was afraid he would refuse. Martin paused for a second. He had already learned to live without her, but he was curious as to why she suddenly decided to call. All right. When? Tomorrow evening. At the cafe where we always used to sit together, she suggested, hoping that mentioning their happy times would touch him. Okay, he replied briefly and hung up. The next evening, Sarah arrived at the cafe early to prepare for their conversation. She sat at a table by the window, recalling the times they had laughed, shared dreams, and made plans together. When the door opened and Martin walked in, her heart tightened. He looked different, more composed, confident, even slightly distant. Hello, he said, sitting across from her. Hello, Sarah replied, trying to smile. Thank you for coming. Not a problem. What did you want to say? He asked directly, not giving her time for unnecessary emotions. Sarah took a sip of her coffee to gather her thoughts. I wanted to apologize for everything I did. I know I ruined our life, and I'm so sorry. Her voice trembled. I want you to know that I've realized my mistakes. I lost you, and now I understand that you were the most important thing in my life. Martin looked at her closely. He heard her words, but he couldn't help feeling that something had changed between them forever. I'm glad you understand, he finally said, but I'm not the same person I was before. And our relationship, it's not the same anymore. Sarah nearly burst into tears. Martin, please, give me one more chance. I know I ruined everything, but I'm ready to work on it. I'm ready to prove to you that I've changed. Martin thought for a moment. He saw her sincerity, but the warmth that used to be in his heart was no longer there. Sarah, I can't promise you anything. My life has moved on. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. What do you mean? She asked, looking him in the eyes. Martin held her gaze for a few seconds before replying. I'm seeing someone else. Her name is Eliza. We've been together for 2 months. Sarah felt her heart break. She didn't know what to say. But I thought we could still be together, she whispered. Sarah, I gave you a chance. I tried. But betrayal isn't something you easily forget. Eliza, she's different. She's kind, honest, and I feel like I can trust her again. Sarah lowered her head, trying to hold back tears. Are you happy? She asked. Yes, Martin replied, his voice calm and confident. I'm happy. Sarah realized that she had lost him forever, but she didn't want to give up so easily. I want to at least try to fix our relationship, she said. I'm willing to wait. Martin looked at her with sadness. Sarah, it's no longer a matter of time. It's a matter of trust, and I'm not sure we can rebuild it. They sat in silence until the waiter brought the bill. Martin stood up, glanced at Sarah, and said, I wish you find your happiness, Sarah, but please, don't ruin your life anymore. And don't ruin the lives of others. Sarah simply nodded, unable to find the words. She sat at the table, watching as Martin left the cafe, leaving her in emptiness. Meanwhile, Martin returned home, where Eliza was waiting for him. She greeted him with a warm smile. How did the meeting go? She asked, handing him a cup of tea. It was tense, but necessary, Martin replied, sitting down next to her. She wants to come back, but I can't anymore. Eliza embraced him, letting him feel that he had made the right choice. You're strong, she said, and now we can focus on our future. Martin smiled, feeling that his life was finally becoming stable and happy. Sarah was part of his past, and with Eliza, he was beginning to build a new life. Sarah, on the other hand, decided not to interfere with Martin anymore. She realized she had lost her chance because of her mistakes. But now, she had to find her own path and accept that some things couldn't be undone. The next weeks for Martin passed in a whirlwind of events. Eliza, his new girlfriend, was attentive, caring, and seemed perfect. At the same time, he couldn't ignore Sarah's constant attempts to win him back. She sent him messages, wrote letters, and even showed up at places he frequented. Her desperation was obvious. One evening, while Martin and Eliza were having dinner at a cozy restaurant, his phone vibrated. The message was from Sarah. Martin, this is important. Please give me a chance to talk one last time. I can't leave things like this. I'll wait by the park where we once walked together. If you don't come, I'll understand. Martin felt his emotions flare up again. He put the phone down, but Eliza noticed his anxiety. Is something wrong? She asked, looking him in the eye. No, nothing serious, he replied, trying to sound calm. Just someone from the past decided to remind me of themselves. Eliza knew that Martin had a complicated history with his ex-wife, but she tried not to press. She just smiled and changed the subject to avoid ruining the evening. However, later that night, Martin couldn't fall asleep. Sarah's words kept echoing in his mind. What did she want to say? Should he give her this last chance? In the morning, he decided to go. But before leaving the house, he received a call from Eliza. Hi, darling. Will you be able to meet for lunch today? I thought we could take a walk by the lake. Martin hesitated. He didn't want to hurt Eliza, but he knew he had to resolve things with Sarah to close that chapter for good. I'm a bit busy today, he replied. But I'll call you later, okay? All right, she said with a slight note of disappointment in her voice. Just don't disappear. The park was cold and gloomy. Sarah was already waiting for him on the bench under the old oak tree, its yellowed leaves still falling. She looked tired, but there was hope in her eyes. When Martin approached, she stood up. Thank you for coming, she said. I'm here just because you asked, he replied. What do you want to say? Sarah lowered her head, trying to collect her thoughts. Martin, I've made a lot of mistakes, but you were everything to me, and I can't just let you go. I know you have Eliza, and I understand that you're happy with her, but I want to fight for you. Martin sighed. Sarah, it's not that simple. Do you want me to forget everything that happened and start over? Do you even realize how hard that would be for me? I know, she said, her voice full of pain, but I'm ready to go through everything. I'm ready to fix my mistakes every day if you give me the chance. They were silent for a few minutes while Martin tried to understand what he felt. On one hand, Sarah was part of his past that he couldn't forget. On the other hand, Eliza was the bright future that gave him hope for a new life. I need to think, he finally said. I can't give you an answer right now. Sarah nodded, though she looked disappointed. I understand, she whispered, but know that I will wait. Always. That evening, Martin returned home and found Eliza waiting for him. She had prepared dinner and greeted him with a warm smile. How was your day? She asked. Same as usual, he replied, trying not to reveal his thoughts. But Eliza was sensitive and immediately noticed his detachment. Is something wrong? She asked, sitting next to him. Martin didn't want to lie, so he decided to be honest. I met with Sarah today, he confessed. Eliza fell silent for a few seconds, but her face remained calm. And what did she say? She wants to come back. She says she's ready to fight for our relationship, he replied. Eliza lowered her gaze. She had expected this, but didn't know how to react. And what do you feel? She finally asked. I don't know, he answered honestly. You've given me something I haven't felt in a long time. Peace, trust. But Sarah was an important part of my life, and I don't know how to let that go. Eliza nodded, trying to hide her pain. I won't force you to make a choice, Martin, but you have to decide what you want. I don't want to be your second option. The next few days were a real trial for Martin. Sarah kept reminding him of herself, and her words echoed in his mind. But Eliza remained by his side, giving him a sense of stability. One evening, while walking through the city, he received a call from Jonathan. Martin, I need to talk to you. It's about Sarah. What now? Martin asked, sensing that it was something important. This isn't a phone conversation. Come to the bar near your place, Jonathan replied and hung up. At the bar, Jonathan sat with a serious expression on his face. Listen, Martin, I didn't want to interfere, but I have to. Sarah. She was still seeing Jack even after she told you she wanted to fix things. Martin felt the blood rush to his head. Are you sure? I have proof, Jonathan said, pulling out his phone and showing a few photos. I don't know what she's planning, but she's not as sincere as she seems. Martin stared at the photos for a long time, trying to collect his thoughts. And Eliza? What do you think of her? He asked. Eliza? She loves you, Martin, and I think you know that. That night, Martin sat in his apartment for a long time, staring into the darkness. Sarah, his past, haunting him, and Eliza, who had given him a chance at a fresh start. His mind screamed to move forward, but his heart couldn't decide. The next morning, Martin met with both Eliza and Sarah separately. He spoke honestly with each of them, but gave neither of them a definitive answer. Who had actually sent the photos of Sarah with Jack to Jonathan, and was it an attempt to manipulate Martin into making a decision?